The Secretary of Defense is opposing President Trump's threat to send the military into states to end police brutality protests. In his first public comments since protests erupted, Mark Esper told reporters he does not support the use of military force to contain American streets.
I've always believed and continue to believe that the National Guard is best suited for performing domestic support to civil authorities in these situations, in support of local law enforcement. I say this not only as Secretary of Defense, but also as a former soldier and a former member of the National Guard. The option to use active duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort and only in the most urgent and dire of situations. We are not in one of those situations now. I do not support invoking the Insurrection Act.
White House correspondent Weijia Jiang reports on another long night of demonstrations in D.C.
Protesters demanded justice late into the night outside the White House, where Park police and military officers in riot gear stood guard behind 8-foot fences. Earlier, demonstrators used powerful body language as they filled the streets. Some said they were emboldened by President Trump's recent action.
We're met with pepper spray and then the National Guard and tanks instead of solving the real issue at hand. Why is he spending money on that type of resources instead of taking care of what we're asking him to? He's not listening.
At the Lincoln Memorial, National Guard troops lined the steps among the nearly 3,000 that the Trump administration has dispatched across the city. The president has threatened to send military police to states that he believes are not doing enough to control violent crowds, drawing bipartisan criticism.
How dare you pervert the honor of our military by threatening to use them against their fellow Americans?
People who are protesting peacefully ought to be allowed to do that.
As backlash continued to brew over a photo op at a church on Monday, Mr. Trump visited a shrine yesterday, one dedicated to Pope John Paul II. Washington Archbishop Wilton Gregory issued an unusually scathing statement about the visit. "I find it baffling and reprehensible that any Catholic facility would allow itself to be so egregiously misused and manipulated."
The moment has come for our nation to deal with systemic racism.
Former Vice President Joe Biden told voters he is the leader to unite the nation.
A country is crying out for leadership. Leadership that can unite us, leadership that brings us together, leadership that can recognize pain and deep grief of communities that have had a knee on their neck for a long time.
And Weijia Jiang joins me now from the White House. Hi, Weijia. What are the implications of this comment from Esper saying he does not support the use of the Insurrection Act?
Well, it really forces President Trump to explain why he has suggested invoking it, because Secretary Esper is pretty much directly contradicting the president when he says, and I want to read you what he said today because it is important. I think we heard from him saying that basically, I do not support invoking the Insurrection Act. He says the option to use active duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort in the most urgent and dire situations, and he doesn't believe that the country is at that level. So then, President Trump has to answer why he does, or why he believes it doesn't have to rise to that level in order for the administration to deploy troops. So really now the pressure is on Mr. Trump to explain his desires, and we'll have to watch to see if he pulls back, this hard line about sending troops into states, because the president has made clear he believes that they are needed to control what he calls lowlifes and losers, and he thinks states should actually be asking for more help from the U.S. military.
And Weijia, this comes shortly after a Pentagon advisor resigned, correct, accusing Esper of violating his oath to the Constitution. Can you give us some insight into that?
So this was an advisor to the Defense Department, and he did resign because he felt that Esper should not have been involved in the way that he was during the president's trip to St. John's, but more importantly, in the events that happened beforehand. Of course, we've talked a lot about the use of force that we saw to clear those protesters from Lafayette Park. And this advisor said that not only did Esper violate his oath of office, but he says that the secretary supported the use of force to disperse protesters, which he did not agree with and does not line up with his duties. And so I think it sends a huge message. That might have been one reason why Secretary Esper decided to speak out publicly this morning and try to clarify, that it was not his plan to do that, to use this force, which really begs the question, who exactly authorized these tactics and when? Because this all unfolded so quickly, as you'll remember, but it's still important to ask those questions because, these protests might not end and there might be another situation where the use of force is an option. But just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And that's, I think, what these military officials are trying to get at when they criticize Esper's role.
And we are learning more about the source of the idea for President Trump's visit to St. John's Church. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, sources tell us that it was actually Ivanka Trump, the president's daughter, who hatched this idea for him to walk over across the street to the church, believing that it would be a show of strength and something that could help heal the country in that situation, although we are told she didn't have any role in, the logistical steps that were required for that to happen, including clearing out whoever was in the park. And so the White House also tells us that the president was really interested in this. He wanted to go there because he liked the symbol that the church stood for. He said himself that he never thought he was going to survey the damage because the church was boarded up, but he thought it was important there to send a message. Of course, as we are seeing right now on the screen, that message became a little murky when he held up the Bible and showed it off the way that he did, because religious leaders quickly criticized him and said that that was inappropriate, that they felt insulted, and they wanted to know why he did that once he got to the church, and what his intention was with showing off the Bible and also calling his staffers over to take pictures.
And President Trump is ordering the Republican Party to move its convention out of North Carolina after the state's governor said they cannot host 19,000 people in August. What has to happen for the convention to be moved? And do we know where it could go? And it's also my understanding that there may be some legal issues because contracts have already been signed to hold it there.
Right. Right. Well, if you've ever been to one of these conventions, you can see firsthand how much planning is involved. Basically, the entire heart of a city turns into, for a week or so, the hub of an entire party. And there are vendors, there are people who have to come in and invest money, invest time, and it takes a lot of time to plan one of these conventions. And so, now we know that it's not going to happen in North Carolina, and the planning is starting from scratch again. The conversations are just happening with other governors, for example, Tennessee, because Nashville is at the top of the list of possibilities. You also had the governor of Georgia retweeting the president saying, I hope you have Georgia on your mind. So we don't really know yet where it will be, but regardless of what the location is, it is going to be a logistical nightmare, and as you mentioned, perhaps a legal battle for those people in North Carolina who will be impacted. But for now, those are challenges that the RNC will have to deal with, because again, they told CBS News that that convention will not be in Charlotte as planned.
All right. Well, Weijia Jiang at the White House, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thanks.